So the the thing or the component that helps a person to cross the divide between theory and application is a technique. And it sounds to me like you were applying one technique or another, you know. And any technique that you're doing, I can put into the four directions. I don't know if you've ever reverse engineered it, but if somebody comes and they're like, I have this technique, and I'm like, that's cool, I could easily categorize that within one of my four directions because it's going to be one of the four. It's pretty comprehensive in that way. So that's kind of an acute way of looking at it. That's a smaller way of looking at the idea of a mechanism to help me cross the divide between theory and application. But then there's the more elongated, broad way to look at that, and that is the learn, grow, and evolve way of looking at it. I think one way that we could talk about it is the way that Don Juan would talk about the universe. He would use the term forces, and that can be a confusing word in English, you know, when we think about forces, but really it has to do with momentum. The force is a result of accumulation of momentum of some sort. You could say that a car can generate force because of momentum. A fist can generate force because of momentum. But so can your habits, so can your thoughts, so can the collective environment. So could collective environment in terms of the entire human species has a momentum to it. And we could say that that is a force. And so in Don Juan's mind, the entire universe is just a series of momentous forces. He didn't use the word momentum. I'm just using that to help, you know, bring that concept to a way that we can work with it a little bit. But the idea is learn, grow, and evolve. Well, what's the mechanism for learning? That's the same thing that crosses the divide between theory and application. That's technique. So the technique helps us to be more present so that we can learn. But the grow and the evolve is when we get into situations that we've been in before. If we were practicing the four directions, the force going into that situation is going to be different. So Ida, we could say that the force of Ida, like the accumulated momentum of your being, of your life. You know how people say, like, every choice I've made, everything has brought me to this point right now. They say that like when weird or things that seem like synchronicities, or you know, they say it then, but that's actually everything. Like every single point of your life, everything has brought you to that point. That's a force, right? The momentum of your life experience, you could look at it as a type of force. Well, how do you interact with that force? It sounds like something in the cognitive direction of attention. How are we interacting with the forces of our own lives? So in an acute way of looking at it, the practice is a technique that helps us to cross the divide between theory and application. A more broad way of looking at it is the practice helps us to learn, grow, and evolve so that when we end up in situations that you can't prep for, you can't specifically necessarily plan for, right? So in martial arts, you learn how to defend yourself, but you don't necessarily learn a very specific scenario like the second you walk off the train or something like that, and you're going down the stairs and all of a sudden someone's there. Like you didn't train for that specifically, but the techniques that you've been doing will help you to adapt in that unique situation that you're in because of the learn, grow, and evolve with self-awareness principle. So it sounds to me that you were exercising both. Ida, you were exercising, and I think you might not be surprised. I think general people who start to practice this, when you get into a situation that requires adaptation, I go immediately to the warrior considerations and the four directions immediately. So if I'm in any situation where I'm like, oh, like I didn't specifically plan for this, I didn't specifically plan for, you know, ICE and a Gestapo type of scenario to drop in Chicago. You know, I didn't plan for that, right? So what do? You know, well, I go back to my four directions practice and I learn and I grow and I evolve with self-awareness so that when I repeat and I'm in a similar situation, I'll be able to adapt more elegantly. So with the back pain or with any pain that we experience, it's a similar thing, or situations of how do we deal with pain? How do we deal with illness? How do we deal with loss? How do we deal with insanity in the world around us? And deal, I think the best word that we could use for deal is how do we adapt? How do we maintain relative harmony in the midst of the exterior environment not being all too harmonious? Self-awareness and the momentum of adaptivity grows in degrees over time, assuming that the practice is maintained and assuming that we're not leaking power. Because there's two primary things, because we're talking about forces of momentum. And one of the worst things we can do in this practice is to relinquish or interfere with our own momentum. But that's absolutely correct. If we're doing our practice, if we stick to it little bit by little bit, then that will accumulate over time.